About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
And this is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. A year ago, we started this journey of exploring the research of scientists trying to understand what consciousness is and does. We've focused on the various models people have developed to explain our experience, and we've explored the experiments that supported those models. We learned that our minds can be thought of having three aspects. What we are aware of, our personal awareness, a very small part of our consciousness. Then what we aren't aware of, that's keeping our bodies going, and also includes our fears and beliefs about potential threats and dangers, which we call the individual subconscious. And what we aren't aware of that enlivens our beings and guides us in our actions, which we're calling the individual superconscious. We learned that we can change our state of consciousness and shift what aspects of mind we are aware of and what we're capable of in each moment. We learned that while it's possible to say where in the brain various processes are active, no one has yet been able to demonstrate where memories are stored or what the pathway is by which ideas and thoughts come into being. We also saw that the responses in our body to both our individual mental activity and what's going on around us happen far faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel through the body. So it's clear that who and what we are, that our consciousness and our decisions and choices aren't all originating in the brain. As a result, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the brain, but is in fact the activity of a kind of field that surrounds and permeates the whole body. This field appears to be at least partly electromagnetic because it's possible to measure electromagnetic activity for several feet around the body. So the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter that receives messages from the mind and transmits them to the body and maybe beyond that, and receives messages from the senses and transmits them to the body and to this field we're calling the mind. We also learned that the brain modifies what it receives from both the senses and the mind to fit the past patterns of experience that are stored as connections among the neurons, hardwired, according to Begg's principle that neurons that fire together wire together. This means that we see and hear and feel what we expect or believe we will experience. Other experiments we looked at demonstrated that what we call the individual mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. And this may be why most reports of those who've gone through this process do not fit past patterns of experiences that are stored in their brain's neuronal connections. The brain isn't working, but the mind appears to be. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists during and after the body is functioning. We'll call that the superconscious. It develops with the body and brain as the subconscious and is being told by the sensory parts of the brain what the world out there is like, our personal awareness. Now, being a field means that the mind, our consciousness, has a unique pattern of vibration that makes it different from all other fields. And some experiments have demonstrated that people, and some animals, who have minds that are vibrating along the same patterns, that is, they resonate with each other, are able to sense when another is focusing attention on them, or when someone they care about is about to come home. Their bodies change in subtle ways when someone they're connected with turns attention their way, even though they can't be seen or heard. Beyond all that, we've learned that mind affects matter, as demonstrated in the famous double-slit experiments in quantum physics, where the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. It's also demonstrated in the shifting readouts on random number generators on that network of computers that's called the Global Consciousness Project. Seeing all of this, we begin to understand how bodies and environments shift and change as people change their thought processes, what they're focusing on in the personal awareness part of their consciousness, and we can also understand the effectiveness of mental or spiritual healing and what's called the placebo effect, how the belief in a treatment can help a patient receiving that treatment experience healing. Because of the nature of fields and because of things like the Global Consciousness Project, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field, a global brain, a noosphere, or a collective consciousness. And more scientists are equating that larger field with the quantum or zero-point field, out of which all matter and energy arises in an orderly system that we call the universe. A field that, as we learned some weeks ago, Irvin Laszlo calls the Akashic field, using a Sanskrit term for memory or data storage. Based on all of that, over the last few weeks, we've begun to explore some of the more popular ideas of what the mind can do, including the way the world around us reflects what we're focusing on in what's been called the law of attraction, and the way we can access information in the Akashic or quantum field through our insight, intuition, and the increasingly understood process of channeling. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mention. This week, we're continuing to explore the work on channeling. This time, we're going to look at a specific form of channeling called mediumship, which is best defined as accessing the ongoing consciousness of those who are no longer occupying their physical bodies. Pursuing research from this post-materialist framework, engineering and psychology professor Dr. Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona has developed research protocols for accessing consciousness that survives physical death. And I'll let him explain.
That the information strongly supports the idea that consciousness survives physical death. And that's a post-materialist perspective. The claim that staunch materialists would like to make is that many of what are called near-death experiences can be explained as residual firing of either the cortex or subcortical structures after it's been damaged or after the heart's stopped. The problem with that, I call it wishful thinking, is because if you look at the both human research and animal research, it's well documented that literally all electrical activity ceases within 40 seconds to a minute of the time that blood flow has stopped going to the brain. there is no evidence of electrical firing of the brain at all. So for people to therefore think that somehow, well, their brain is still firing, it's just that we can't electrically see it, the reason why they're pushed to that conclusion is because they find it impossible to believe that one's consciousness could continue after the brain had stopped functioning. That's because they're stuck believing this simple materialist view. Now, those people have not thought through the issue of the fact that neuroscience methods, correlation, stimulation, and ablation, do not prove the conclusion that the brain creates consciousness any more than correlation, stimulation, and ablation would conclude that a television set created the TV signals. They don't understand that core logic.
So Gary Schwartz, operating from the understanding that consciousness is not generated by the brain, but can be experienced because of sensory capabilities, has been working on ways to access the information that the consciousness that seems to be operating apart from the brain and seems to continue after the brain is no longer functioning can be accessed. He's developed a method to identify what he calls clinical research mediums or experimental research mediums, people who can consistently and effectively access individual fields of mind that are no longer associated with bodies. They have passed on into the realm we call death. Here's his description of some of that research.
I'm going to talk to you about a scientific approach to looking at spirit communication technology. There are three different approaches that people typically have to this topic. One is that we're skeptical. We're convinced that it's ashes to ashes, dust to dust, case closed, like the well-known skeptic Michael Shermer. Or we may be an unsure agnostic, such as Bertrand Russell, who wrote the book The Will to Doubt, and we're unsure whether or not there's life after death. And finally, we might be a certain believer, such as John Edward of Crossing Over, who was a famous medium who I had the privilege of testing before he had his best-selling television show called Crossing Over. I first published research using technology in 2010 in a scientific journal, peer-reviewed, called Explore. Working with evidential research mediums, we would invite specific hypothesized spirit participants or collaborators to either enter the chamber with the light-tight box that contained this photomultiplier on some trials, 5-minute trials, and it would count the number of photons in the pitch black, like this bar here, the one on the left, hopefully you can see the cursor, versus the shorter bar, which were an equal number of trials, which were baselines or controls. So we had spirit intention trials and controls. And you can see, and this was the second of the three experiments, that this bar is double the height of this one, statistically significant for someone who we called Sophia. Here's another experiment that was done with an individual that we called Harry. Again, that same effect, double the number of detected photons when he was purportedly inside the box versus when he was not. And although we did not mention this in the paper per se 10 years ago, this Harry actually referred to this individual here. And some of you may recognize him. And yes, that looks like Harry Houdini. Talk about an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. So in this particular experiment, there was one that was published in 2011. There was a 30-minute pre-baseline period, so we would know what the camera was looking at when no one was there. Then 30 minutes where they were invited to go inside the chamber. This is all done by computer automatically. And this is what has forced me to come to the conclusion that there's something very real going on here. In this research, we did what we call a personal identification test. So imagine this. You have a hypothesized spirit sitting in a chair, and he's either in Arizona or he's in Ohio. How does he know which laboratory to go to on a given night? Well, there's an evidential research medium who meets with the hypothesized team, and she has the code, the secret code, that tells them where on a given night to go. So let's say they're here in Arizona. So they'll be sitting in a chair with their hands over this box, their info energy hands, following the instructions on the screen. Simultaneously, the computer over here is collecting the same data, but there's nobody there. And on each night, they'll be in one of the two positions. And it's not until all 24 nights are completed that we then break the code and look and see whether or not you get positive results when they're in the laboratory that they're supposed to be in, and no results when it was a control laboratory. Now, we said this is a personal identification test, and the reason is because the computer will ask, such as, is this your father's occupation? And it'll put up, let's say, priest, or it could put up doctor. And depending upon the particular hypothesized spirit, one of these would fit them and one of them would not. It would ask, what is your father's name? Was this your father's name? Was this your mother's name? Was this your date of birth? Is this where you were born? Was this your occupation? Did you write this book? Did you die of this disease or whatever cause of death? So by asking these personal identification questions, only somebody who knows those details would be able to accurately pass. We did a total of 6 experiments. I'm just now submitting these findings for publication. Look at the total number of sessions, 480 sessions. And then here, E and F are the actual experiments I just told you about. And this is how it's graphed. And you'll notice that these blue lines, these blue arrows, show that there's a peak, i.e. the predicted effect was observed in every single experiment. Total of 6 experiments, all producing the same replicated finding. You do enough experiments and you use standard and responsible statistics, and you find the same result again and again. You end up ruling out the chance hypothesis. All of this is automatically stored and then analyzed using a very formal procedure, which any scientist could look at and confirm that what we did was correct.
Dr. Schwartz has been working with his engineering knowledge as well as understanding of experimental methods to create experiments that couldn't possibly be misunderstood or misdone, using computers as much as possible. He uses a light box that measures individual photons to see whether there's an increase in the photons in the space when they ask someone through a medium to show up and be present. And he uses multiple laboratories with multiple computer access points to ask questions and get responses from those beings, those consciousnesses that are being called upon to enter into their space. Of course, this is quite controversial research, and he is doing everything he can to make sure that every skeptical scientist that addresses it can't find anything wrong with it. Because in our world of science, we are materialists. We tend to look at only that which we can measure. So he's measuring. It's very interesting to watch Gary Schwartz at work. Which brings us to our book, which is, surprise, surprise, The Afterlife Experiments, written by Gary Schwartz and William Simon. The subtitle is Breakthrough Scientific Evidence of Life After Death, and it's actually what they were doing before the experiments that he described in the interview above. It was published in 2002 by Penguin Pocket Books, which is now a division of Simon & Schuster, or was in 2002. And Deepak Chopra put his little commentary on here. All right. And it also looks as if Linda Russick's involved. Linda Russick was involved in the book we talked about last time. As usual, we'll look at the contents. The foreword by Deepak Chopra. They talk about their process of getting into this research. Part 2 is the HBO Dream Team experiment. They had mediums reading with the cameras on, Patricia readings, Ronnie readings. They're questioning whether this is precognition or some other form of psi behavior, and they come up with their results. Part 3, the Miraval Silent Sitter Experiment, looking for a new design. They had the Christopher readings, the Pat Price readings, and is there such a thing as precognition? Then the Canyon Ranch, totally silent sitters experiment. And what if the sitters speak? An unexpected visitor. In part 5, we're getting up to chapter 15. What's fraud got to do with it? So they're looking at possible fraud issues here. Chapter 17, the Campbell White Crow readings. And they talk about some detail in their appendixes, integrating science and spirituality. B, they call the energy is love. Appendix C, journal article on accuracy and replicability of after-death communication. Another one, Appendix D, journal article on accuracy and replicability of anomalous information retrieval. Now, anomalous information retrieval is the technical term that scientists have invented to explain information that is received from no material source. Anomalous information retrieval, which has the interesting acronym AIR. I reviewed a number of journal articles for IONS, and this was the standard way for scientists to talk about it. And then finally in Appendix E, a journal article on the White Crow readings. So they talk about it in some detail. So for what it's worth, Deepak Chopra says, I consider this visionary book a look around at one of those high spots, a place where love and memory are bound together, where no one is ever lost to anyone else. A vast domain of knowledge is opened up by even the shortest visit here. And they go on and talk about how much of what is possible in this kind of communication is a result of the love. The sitter is the person that is asking for the information, and then the medium is the person who is expressing the information. Here's an example. So the medium says, quote, and enjoy the tea, quote. I have no idea what that means, enjoy the tea. Like, I feel like I'm having tea, but enjoy it. Like, drink. I have no idea what this is, but I feel it's kind of inside humor. Enjoy the tea. The sitter had never liked tea when her husband was alive, but since his death had begun to drink tea regularly. Looking at what this is saying, we can see that they're exploring how many of the questions that are coming up from the medium or to the medium might apply. The text goes on, how many of the medium's statements would apply to you? They were approximately 70% correct for the sitter over the course of the entire reading. Some people, the text says, still insist that all we have been seeing in our laboratory experiments is examples of cold reading technique that any professional stage mentalist can duplicate. But in fact, cold readers blanch when we challenge them to produce information this accurate and this unusual with a sitter unknown to them. And skeptics who claim that this is some kind of fraud the mediums are working on us have nonetheless been unable to point out any error in our experimental technique to account for the results. That's all from the foreword to the book, The Afterlife Experiments, by Gary Schwartz, William Simon, and Linda Russick. If you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, and how our lives could be better if we understood it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, and that sound tells me we need to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, are curious about. Cerebral spinal fluid is in the research news today, partly because of its role in Alzheimer's research and the effect of COVID on the brain. So there's quite a bit of work going on, actually. And a new study has identified that there's a very fine network of fibers inside the brain case through which this fluid travels. According to the study, quote, a newfound protective shield in the brain helps clear waste from that organ and serves as a sentry tower for watchful immune cells that monitor for signs of infection. The study, published January 5 in the journal Science, describes a thin sheet of tissue that measures only a few cells thick and splits the subarachnoid space into two halves horizontally. These distinct layers of tissue that sit between the inner surface of the skull and the outer surface of the brain contains a spiderweb-like network of connective tissue through which the cerebrospinal fluid flows. It flows through various tubes and compartments in and around the brain. Now, part of why this is interesting is that there is a theory that the cerebrospinal fluid, called CSF, which is the primary means by which the body and brain are connected, may also connect the energy centers that make up the unique pattern of the individual. A man named Mauro Zapatero explains that he believes the flow of fluids strongly affected by the presence of electromagnetic fields is likely to lead to a very interesting new field of research having to do with how consciousness is maintained throughout the body. Well, that's got to be it for today's show. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of all the shows that we've done and links to the various resources we refer to on the show. And there's a form where you can send me your comments and questions. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.